Hey everybody, welcome back. We are here to continue our discussion of George Orwell's 1984. It's the big one. I hope I do it justice. Today, we are going to talk about language and sort of how Orwell approaches language in this book, what his thoughts on language are, and why language is such a very, very important part of this novel. So to begin with, we actually want to go a few years before the publication of this book. So this book was published in 1949. In 1946, Orwell wrote an essay called Politics and the English Language. And most of what that essay is advice for people who are trying to write clearly and with precision, right? It's a lot of rules about how not to use, for example, overdone cliches or bombastic language or complex grammar forms. The essential idea behind the essay is you need to be able to write to be understood. But there was an undercurrent to the essay, as evidenced by the title, which is about why it's so important that writers write clearly and that writers especially be conscious of what they are doing when they write. And there's a great line kind of near the end of the essay, which reads as follows. He says, "Political language, and with variations, this is true of all political parties, from conservatives to anarchists, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind." Oh, I love that line. That's such a good line. And behind that line is basically that, the words that we use kind of establish the reality that we occupy. So if you are a journalist or if you are a politician, you have to choose your words real carefully because they will establish the political reality of the world that you're living in. And the political reality of a world is like, politics is not just a bunch of people in suits grifting money off of lobbyists and taxpayers. Politics is basically how we as a society decide what is right and wrong and what we should and should not do. And somebody who is very, very good with words will be able to affect how those decisions go. And if they're a good person and good with words, then fantastic. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself is a great line. And I know that Roosevelt is problematic in his own ways, but it was still a great line. So I think that's kind of where we have to start, is how do the powerful manipulate language in order to affect the way that we, the ostensibly, let's call it less powerful, see our world. And what does this have to do then with 1984? And it's actually really neat. When you read the essay, the Politics in the English Language essay, you can actually see some things that get incorporated almost directly into 1984. In addition to the idea of how language shapes thoughts, there's a few really neat images in there, especially one of the sort of the man in the images of a man in glasses that the light is reflecting off his glasses and you can't see anything, just blank slates. And that gets used in the essay and it gets used in the cantina scene in 1984 when Winston goes to have lunch with his friend Symes. So let's talk about it. Language in this book is central because the party, which controls all facets of life in Oceania, has a death grip on language. And the way that they are doing this is through something called Newspeak. Now, if you have not read all the way through, I know it's certainly possible that you got to the end of the last chapter of the book and you say, oh, Winston loved Big Brother. He loved Big Brother. And then you said, oh, well, I guess that's the end of the book. But there is another thing. There's the Principles of Newspeak, and you really want to read those for a couple of reasons. One of them, kind of a little sneaky reason, is that if you read the Principles of Newspeak, we can just do the first sentence if you want. Newspeak was the official language of Oceania and had been devised to meet the ideological needs of Ingsoc, or English socialism. What did you hear in that sentence? If you heard the word was, and bonus if you heard had been, good for you. Because what this does is kind of an in-universe essay about Newspeak. And what it does is it establishes that, the party doesn't last. The party doesn't survive. The party at some point collapses, and now this appendix is sort of like a historical afterword. It's somebody doing research on Ingsoc and how it operated and kind of trying to understand what this new language was they were trying to do. So if you got to the end of 1984 and you were worried that this is it, this is the end, the party will always win, the party will always succeed. That essay puts that to rest, that no, the party does not win, the party does not succeed. Eventually, the party does come down. Bonus, if you've read The Handmaid's Tale and you see that Margaret Atwood does something very similar. If we ever get to The Handmaid's Tale, we'll look at that. But that's getting off topic. The principles of Newspeak are basically outlining this language that the party has crafted with a very specific intent. In the scene where Winston goes to the cafeteria and he has lunch with his colleague Symes, and Symes is working on the Newspeak dictionary, and Symes goes off on great lengths about the beauty of Newspeak. And he says, the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought. And he goes on and gives a whole bunch of other of examples, right? The idea being, for example, why do we need so many words for good? Why do we have good, fantastic, superb, splendid, excellent, magnificent, marvelous, right? Why do we have all of these words? Why can't we just use good and be done with it? And if we need to sort of emphasize good, well, we just add plus. Plus good. That was a plus good movie. And maybe there might be, on occasion, something that extends beyond that. You say, this was a double plus good dinner. There we go. Really, we've sort of taken a whole crop of words and just thrown them in the garbage. We don't need them because we have good and plus good and double plus good. And as Symes noted, the existence of a word, especially an adjective, implies the existence of his opposite. And he does note that good and bad, while they are, in common parlance, opposites, they may not have precisely opposite meanings. However, if you want to have the precise opposite to good, you don't defer to another word, good Lord, no, you say ungood. There we go. That is the opposite of good is ungood. And then plus ungood, and then double plus ungood. And so now you have 6 words, which are basically one word, which are the sum total of the words that you need to talk about sort of the quality of something. And the idea, it's brilliant, isn't it? I do find myself in everyday conversation using plus good, double plus on good. I use that a lot. And the people who know kind of look at me funny. People who don't know also look at me funny. But that's not the point. The point is that the purpose of Newspeak is to take that whole raft of words that we would normally have in the bucket for good and great and marvelous and awesome and terrible and awful and horrible, get rid of all of those and reduce it essentially down to variations on one word. Why? And he talks about some other options as well, like cold, for example. You have cold, double plus cold, uncold, plus uncold, double plus uncold. So, we say, oh, today is a plus good uncold day today. Why do this? And the stated reason, which Orwell via Symes comes out directly and tells us, is to reduce the possible range of thought. The idea being, and this is something which we would know today as cognitive linguistics, it's based on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is, from what I understand, I'm not a linguistics expert, from what I understand is kind of debunked, but not really debunked, but kind of debunked. And there's a lot, if you want to go into linguists, if you want to go into a really good argument and go to a linguist subreddit, I'm sure there's a r/linguist or something, and just say, hey, I think the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is great, and then just watch the world burn. But anyway, the point of these theories is that what we think determines what words we have determines what we can think. If we have a word for something, then we can think about that thing. If we don't have a word for that thing, then we can't really understand it. And it's an interesting idea. And it's an idea that I don't know if Orwell had done a lot of study into this topic, but it's an idea that Orwell found a political use for. Okay, why? Well, for example, how can you, as a totalitarian state, control all of your people and make sure they're all behaving correctly? Well, of course, one way is mass surveillance, and we see that in the book all the time, right? Mass surveillance, there are people watching everywhere, there's view screens on every wall. But mass surveillance, honestly, is time-consuming. It's, who knows how many people have to be watching how many feeds to try and catch one person who twitches a bit, and that's an indication of thought crime. Far better to make thought crime impossible. Because if you cannot think of things, then you can't commit that ultimate crime, right? Take the word free, for example. Free doesn't exist in the Newspeak dictionary except in the sense of this dog is free from fleas, or this dish is free of salt, right? Something like that, meaning without having without. The political or philosophical concept of freedom no longer exists. And so if people can't conceive of the idea of political freedom, if they don't have a word to encompass political freedom, they're never going to want political freedom. It won't even occur to them that such a thing is possible. And so if you are a totalitarian government, that is what you want. The idea being by the time Newspeak is the common parlance, people become native speakers of Newspeak, which they pegged to about 2050. You won't need all that surveillance anymore because it will be literally impossible for people to commit thought crime because they don't have the words for it. And because they don't have the words for it, they cannot conceive of it. Ooh, nasty. Ooh, so nasty. I love it. The appendix gives three sort of levels of Newspeak, in case you're interested. There's the A words, which are your everyday words, like good and ungood, cold and uncold, and so forth. And it talks about the grammar and the inflections of things. It's a remarkably simple language, right? There's no sort of preferred word type. So a word can be an adjective, or it can be an adverb, or it can be a noun or a verb. So yeah, all of that stuff is in the A vocabulary. It's the common person's vocabulary. Then there's the type B, which is the political language, which is where you start to get things like euphemistic language, like a joy camp, which is actually a prison camp. And we'll get to that at some point. And then C, which is more technical and scientific, which doesn't really appear so much in the book. We don't see a lot of the C vocabulary. But it indicates a very concerted effort by the government, by the party, to control the minds of the people through their language. Now, is this really possible? No. The reason it's not possible in the real world is because it's not possible to punish people in the same way that the party punishes people for using the wrong language. Language in the real world is emergent and experimental, and new words come up all the time, and some words gain a certain cultural forbiddance, right? There are certain words, for example, which if I lived in, let's say, to peg a time, 1850s, there's a certain word starting with N that I probably could have used as much as I wanted to talk about certain people living in the United States. And then no one would have bothered, no one would have blinked an eye. Today, I cannot use that word, rightfully so. And it's not that if I use that word, suddenly there's going to be helicopters around my house and a bunch of guys in black are going to show up and I'll never be heard from again, which is what would happen in Oceania if you use the wrong language and commit thought crime. I would be ostracized by people. I would be yelled at by people. I would probably, I would generally have a hard time. But there would be no sort of real consequences to that would impede my life in any way. But in the world of 1984, there would be, right? If you use the wrong language, the thought police show up. They take you to the Ministry of Love, and you are either broken or you're just never heard from again. So that mechanism doesn't exist in this world. So in this world, all language just kind of keeps changing and evolving and moving, and it's all social pressure that kind of decides what words are forbidden, what words should not or cannot be used. There is no official political pressure. I know that there are some languages where this is an attempt. I believe the French have their Académie Française, where there's a bunch of, I assume, old men in gray suits who decide what words are French and what words aren't. But I figure the people who actually are native speakers of French don't much care. Again, the speakers of the language are going to decide what the language is. That's just how it works. And Newspeak is the inverse of this. And I think Orwell knew that too. Orwell knew full well that in the real world, this is not something that would be possible by any real world government to establish a new language of this. So then why did he include it in this book? I think because Orwell did work during the war. He worked for the BBC. He did do some reporting where he had to do the kind of propagandistic reporting about how great everything is going, even though things weren't necessarily going great. I think Orwell had Orwell was very politically inclined. He went to Spain to fight in the Civil War there. He had very serious thoughts about the Soviet Union, did not like them at all, despite Orwell's socialist leanings. And I think he saw the way that politicians could use language and manipulate language in such a way that they would hide their intentions, that they would hide what they really meant to do, that they would placate people. And the opposite of that the people, as a mass, would generally accept what they were told. There's kind of a running, not joke, but there's sort of a running joke throughout this book where the Ministry of Plenty keeps announcing that the chocolate ration has been raised. The chocolate ration has been raised from 25 grams to 30 grams. Huzzah! This is an indication of how great we're doing. Or boot production has been 15 million pairs of boots this year. Hooray! And it's rightfully noted that those numbers have no meaning. In fact, in some cases, you may have, if you were paying attention, you would notice that the chocolate ration was actually reduced to 25 grams last week, but now they tell you it's being increased. And people will believe it. People will just generally will believe what they are told because we have things to do. We're busy. We have lives to live. And I think for a lot of people, it's just a lot more mental effort to try and fact check everything that we are told from businesses or governments. But Orwell's telling us, yeah, it is more work, but you have to do that. You have to be on top of this because if they could, they would. If they were able to manipulate reality in the way that the party does, they absolutely would do that. And so the language lesson that Orwell is teaching us in this book is that we as citizens have to pay attention to what the powerful are telling us and how they are telling us this. And we're lucky that we have people who do this professionally. We have pundits and writers and columnists and people who devote their jobs and their careers to untangling what's being said and telling us, hey, wait a minute. Last week they said they were reducing the chocolate ration, and this week they said they're increasing the chocolate ration. One of those things is not true. In Oceania, of course, those people would be vaporized. They would cease to exist and cease to have ever existed. We'll talk about that when we talk about the party. But yeah, I think when we read this as an example of the use of language and what language can do, I think it's a really, really interesting and slightly scary book because yeah, I believe that a lot of governments would do it if they could. They honestly would. So what should we, again, as readers, take out of this is that, number one, feel fortunate that we do have the ability to speak out when we hear an untruth, that we're not going to get murdered in our sleep by the thought police, that honestly, cancel culture, insofar as it exists, is not nearly as bad as we think it is, because for most people, we'll get over it, right? And it's not death. But nevertheless, there are still social implications for saying things. I'm not going to say that word, y'all. I'm not going to say that word. But yeah, I think that the big one, I think that Orwell wants us to take away, I believe that Orwell wants us to take away, I don't know, he's dead, is that we need to pay attention to what's being said to us, and we need to be able to understand it and dissect it and try to figure out what they're trying to do with language. And honestly, as an English teacher, this is one of the reasons I love this book, is because that's the whole point of my job, is to teach people how to do that, is to teach people how to analyze a text and understand what the writer is doing. And I strongly believe that the more people who can do that, the harder it will be for the powerful to decide what reality is for us. So there we go. That is Language in 1984. A little crack in the voice there. I don't know what happened. Language in 1984. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you have any thoughts on this, I would love to hear from you. If you think you've heard Newspeak out in the world, let me know what your examples are. Chances are they're probably not Newspeak because, again, they're not enforced top-down from the government. They might be euphemisms and things like that, which is a whole other thing. But nevertheless, they're still attempts at thought control via language. So thank you very much for sticking with me. I really appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'd love to hear from you. We'll move on to something else in the next video, so I will see you next time.